In this lesson, we're continuing our discussion of considerations, specifically contract modifications and the pre-existing legal duty rule. But before we jump into that, as a quick refresher, how do we go about forming a traditional enforceable contract? Remember, we have three elements. We need mutual assent between the parties, consideration, and no defenses to formation that would invalidate the otherwise valid contract. In case you're wondering where we are in the big picture flow of our contracts analysis, we're still right here on formation of the traditional enforceable contract, and we're on the C in my cats do sneak. Of course, the C stands for consideration. And remember, we talked about consideration in our last video. What is consideration? It's this idea that we have two requirements, right? We need some sort of legal value involved in a bargained for exchange. Again, we determine if we have consideration by analyzing two elements. Number one, this idea of legal value, and number two, the idea of the bargained for exchange, right? Number one, has the promisee incurred a legal detriment? Remember, a legal detriment can either be an action or a forbearance. A legal detriment, taking an action, meaning taking an action that the promisee would otherwise not be legally obligated to take. A forbearance being refraining from something that the promisee is legally permitted to do. Either of those are satisfied, we're going to say that the promisee is incurring a legal detriment. And number two, right, when we're thinking about the bargained for exchange, we're really just asking, do we have reciprocal inducement? Does the promise induce the detriment, and does the detriment induce the promise? If we have this reciprocity, we say we have a bargained for exchange. So at this point, now that we know how mutual assent between the parties is formed, right, an offer and acceptance, a valid offer is formed, and a valid acceptance of that offer, and now we know what consideration is, right? So if we know what mutual assent is, an offer and acceptance, and we know if that mutual assent, that agreement, is supported by consideration, well, at that point, we know, unless there's a defense that applies, we have a traditional enforceable contract, okay? So what we need to move on to in this lesson is, okay, we have mutual assent between the parties, and that agreement is supported by consideration. So we have a traditional enforceable contract. Assuming no defense applies, that would invalidate the contract, but we'll talk about defenses later, right? But we have mutual assent and consideration, so presumably we have a traditional enforceable contract. Now the question is going to be, what happens is time passes if the parties want to modify the contract. They want to change or alter some term in the contract. How do we make this analysis, or how do we go through this analysis? Well, as often is the case, it's going to depend, number one, on whether the common law or UCC applies. Is this contract in the common law universe? Are we dealing with services or real estate? Or is this contract in the UCC universe, purchase or sale of goods? And our main question is going to be whether the modification needs to be supported by additional or new consideration. And under the common law, we're going to say that in order to be valid, a contract modification must be supported by additional or new consideration. Under the UCC, we're going to say that the contract modification does not need to be supported by additional or new consideration. Under the UCC, we're just going to apply a good faith test, which we'll come back to at the end of this video. But the UCC analysis is pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Common law can be a little bit trickier. So let's jump into the common law analysis first, right? So imagine that we have a traditional enforceable contract governed by the common law, and the parties want to alter the contract. How do we analyze this on a contract law fact pattern? Well, I've actually drawn up a pretty classic fact pattern right here. This gets tested all the time. Something very similar to this, I would wager many of you see before you get out of law school in the bar exam. At some point, you'll probably see this fact pattern or something very similar to this, right? And often it does trip up students, so we want to pay close attention to what's happening here, right? So imagine a very standard lease agreement, right? Promisor is a landlord. Let me grab my marker here. Let's say the promisor is the landlord, and let's say that the promisee is the tenant in this fact pattern. Okay, and it's a standard lease agreement, right? We all know how a lease agreement works. Landlord is promising a place to live, a home, an apartment to the tenant in exchange for rent money to be paid on the first of each month. Let's say it's a 12-month lease for $2,000 to be paid on the first day of each month. Very standard lease agreement. Well, let's break this down in terms of consideration. Assuming we have mutual assent, right? There's no problem with the offer and acceptance. Let's say it meets all of the mutual assent requirements. So we have mutual assent between the parties with a valid offer and valid acceptance of the offer. Our question next to review consideration: is this offer and acceptance, this mutual assent or agreement between the parties, supported by consideration? How do we make this determination? Number one, do we have this legal value involved, right? Which of course is going to ask whether the promisee is incurring a legal detriment. Well, is the promisee, the tenant, taking an action that the tenant would otherwise not be legally required to take? Yes, of course, right? The promisee, the tenant, is paying $2,000 a month to the landlord that otherwise the tenant would have no obligation to pay the landlord. Clear legal detriment, right? So first element is satisfied. We have legal value being exchanged. Next question is this a bargained for exchange? Do we have reciprocal inducement? Does the promise induce the detriment, and does the detriment induce the promise? Well, here the promise is a place to live, right? An apartment for the tenant to live in. That's our promise. Is that promise inducing the tenant to take on the detriment, to pay the landlord the rent money? Obviously, right? The tenant is not paying $2,000 a month to the landlord out of the kindness of his heart. He's paying the $2,000 a month because he wants to live in the apartment, right? So the promise is clearly inducing the detriment, and the detriment is clearly inducing the promise, right? Again, the landlord is not just giving the tenant a home to live in for free, right? The landlord is induced to give the tenant the apartment because the landlord wants the rent money. So we have clear reciprocal inducement, clear bargained for exchange. Promisee is clearly incurring a legal detriment. So we have clear-cut consideration. No type of the fact patterns we talked about looking out for with gift promises or conditional gifts, pre-existing legal duties, nominal or pretenses of consideration, illusory promises. None of that stuff is at play here, right? This is as straightforward as it gets. So we have, let's say that assuming no defenses to formation apply, we have a traditional enforceable contract. Offer, acceptance, supported by consideration. Very clear cut. So no problem this far in the analysis. Okay. But let's say that time passes, right? Time goes on and the parties are performing the contract perfectly, right? The landlord is providing the tenant an apartment to live in, and the tenant is paying the landlord the $2,000 on the first of each month. No problem. But let's say we get to the last month in the agreement, right? We're coming up on the 12th month. And let's say that the tenant has run into some sort of financial burden, some sort of financial hardship. So the tenant is running short on cash. So the tenant approaches the landlord and says, hey landlord, you know, I'm really short on cash right now. It would help me out a ton if we could lower my rent payment to $1,500. It's all I can afford for the last month to be paid on the 1st of December, right? Let's say that the last payment due is December 1, right? So the landlord thinks about it and says, you know what, tenant, you've been a great tenant. You know, I feel bad that you have this financial hardship. The $500 isn't really going to make a big difference for my bottom line. Sure, I'll accept $1,500. So they whip out the contract. They pull it out, the original agreement, and they find the price term, they cross it out, and they write in a new addendum that just says that the tenant is going to pay $1,500. We're lowering the payment due date. We're lowering the payment from $2,000 to $1,500 to be paid on the same date, right? December 1. Okay? They both sign it, they both initial it, they shake hands. very good faith deal, no problem there. And then let's say a month passes after the modification happens. That last month comes around, December 1 rolls around. The tenant pays the $1,500 agreed upon price as per the modification. Let's say another month passes and the landlord, after he's accepted that $1,500, realizes that he's running into some financial problems of his own. He needs that additional $500 from the tenant. What does he do? He sues the tenant for breach of contract, right? He's saying, look, our original agreement was for $2,000. I know we had this modification. I don't care. I want my $2,000, so he sues in court. The question is, can the landlord recover the $500? Well, we know, okay, well, we had this contract modification, so if the contract modification was invalid, then the original contract controls and the landlord can recover the $500, right? If the original contract controls, then the tenant owed the landlord $2,000, only paid $1,500. We know the landlord is entitled to $500. If the contract modification is valid, then the tenant paid everything he owns to the landlord. Landlord can't recover anything. So our entire analysis as to whether the landlord can recover comes down to whether the contract modification was valid. So what's our rule? We know that this is a common law contract, right? We're dealing with a lease of real estate. We know that's common law, not the purchase or sale of a good. So at common law, in order for a contract modification to be valid, we know the modification must be supported by additional or new consideration. So our question has to be, was this modification from $1,500 from $2,000 a month modifying to $1,500 on the last month, was that modification supported by additional or new consideration? If it's not, then the modification is invalid under the common law. Okay? So let's break it down. What is consideration? Remember, at the moment that they changed it, that they modified this contract, we have to ask, at that point, is the promisee incurring a legal detriment, right? Is there additional or new consideration? First question is the promisee, the tenant, incurring a legal detriment? What is a legal detriment? Remember, it's going to be where the tenant or the promisee is taking an action that they would otherwise not be legally obligated to take. Well, we know that the tenant has a legal obligation to pay $2,000 to the landlord on the first of the month. December 1, the tenant has a contractual legal obligation and duty to pay on December 1 the full $2,000. Okay? So the promisee might want to say, or you might want to say on a contract law fact pattern, well, sure, he's taking a detriment, right? It's $1.5K. That's his legal detriment, right? But the problem is the promisee paying something? Is the promisee taking an action that he would otherwise not be legally obligated to take? And the answer is going to be no, right? Because he does. The promisee has a contractual obligation to pay $2,000 on December 1. Lowering that to $1,500 is not going to mean that the tenant is taking any legal detriment on, right? Because what do we say here? And we touched on this in our last video. What's happening, right? All of this is to say there's a pre-existing legal duty, right? Which we know is not consideration. So the promisee, the tenant, has a pre-existing legal duty to pay $2,000 on December 1. Changing that to $1,500 is still not going to satisfy any type of additional or new duty because the promisee, the tenant, already was required under the contractual obligation to pay $2,000. So lowering that $500 and changing nothing else in the contract is not going to equate to any additional or new consideration. Therefore, under the common law, the contract modification is invalid. The landlord would be successful in his suit for $500, right? Contract modification is invalid. Original contract controls. Landlord was owed $2,000, only paid $1,500, recovers the $500. And the reason that students miss this question a lot is because the modification itself looked like it was made in a lot of good faith. And in fact, it was made in good faith, right? Both parties agreed to it. They both signed it. The landlord even said it wasn't going to affect his bottom line very much, right? Was happy to sign the agreement. But the problem is, the common law is strict. Remember, it's not going to have a lot of flexibility. So if the rule is that in order for the modification to be valid, we need additional or new consideration, then that tenant has to take on a legal detriment at the time of this modification. So lowering the rent from $2,000 to $1,900 or $1,800 or to $1,500 isn't going to constitute additional or new consideration because the tenant already owed that money, right? The tenant already had a contractual duty to pay that money to the landlord. So that's not going to be additional or new consideration. So the modification is going to be invalid. Now, what's something that the tenant could do? Right, if the tenant wants to lower the price to $1.5K, but he needs to take on a legal detriment, right? Say the tenant knows a thing or two about contract law, what could the tenant do, right, to make this contract modification valid? Thank you so much for watching this video preview of our Legal Education Accelerator Program, or LEAP for short. If you would like to see the conclusion of this video and gain full access to our entire 1L and 2L video library, integrated outlines, streamable audio versions, additional practice exams with explanations, and much more, we invite you to head over to our website and join the thousands of law students who have already enrolled. To get started with your no-risk free trial today, simply click the link in the description box below or visit www.studicata.com/leap.
Hi everyone, my name is Serena and I'm currently a law student at South Texas College of Law, Houston.
Hi everybody, my name is Shiva and I'm currently a law student at Southwestern.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle and I am a first year student at South Texas College of Law, Houston. I used the Studicata study video series last semester to help me prepare mostly for contracts, and I actually made an A+ in contracts last semester, which I greatly dedicate to the Studicata videos.
By using Studicata to help me prepare for my final exam, I was able to score the highest grade out of my class on the final and even have my essay distributed as the model answer. Not to mention I had done quite poorly on the midterm and was struggling throughout the whole course of the semester, understanding the material and keeping up with lectures.
Because of the Studicata video lectures, I was able to go into my exams with a feeling of confidence. I didn't have to worry about what the rules of law were or how I was going to organize my answer to an essay question.
I would absolutely recommend the Studicata series and their online course materials to anyone. I think that they are not like professor lectures that you might find online or other outside study materials that you may encounter. I think that the Studicata videos really focus on not only ensuring that you understand the material that you're going to encounter on your final, but they also help you to understand kind of the best method for test taking, and they really break down how to approach each problem and the best ways to tackle certain methods on testing, and I think that's really important, and I think it's really special. I don't see that anywhere else in any of the other online resources that I've found. So I would certainly recommend Studicata to anyone who is studying in law school right now. Good luck on your studying, and you're going to do great.
I would definitely recommend Studicata to anybody watching this video. Give it a chance. I'm positive that you will love it, that you will get a lot out of it, and that you will be happy that you gave it a chance. I definitely am. I know I will be using Studicata in the future.
And I cannot thank Studicata enough for getting me through my first semester of law school. I will definitely continue to watch the Studicata video lectures throughout my law school career. and I highly recommend that any future or current law student do the same.